VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network. My name is Jim Schneider. We're thankful that you've joined us. Just a word of warning or caution. If you have young children in the room, you may want to get them occupied with some other activity in another room. Some of the issues may be sensitive here for young ears. But I was astounded when I came across a story that came from LifeSite News last Friday. The headline caught my attention. It says 110 million sexually transmitted infections in the United States, as a C.D.C. report. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control released a report last week, Wednesday, placing the current total number of sexually transmitted disease, or STIs, in the United States at about 110 million. 110 million. Now, keep in mind the total U.S. population is about 315 million. So better than one-third having a sexually transmitted infection. Some 20 million new cases are diagnosed each year, costing taxpayers approximately $16 billion. Young people between the ages of 15 and 24, the article says, are disproportionately affected by the epidemic, accounting for half of all infections, despite being only a quarter of the sexually active population. The total number of new infections of the country has been growing over the last 2 decades, leading one C.D.C. researcher to declare that the U.S. is facing an ongoing severe STI epidemic. Also, it said because STI is preventable, the C.D.C. Satterwhite argued, quote, "We know that preventing STIs could save the nation billions of dollars every year." Folks, we've got a problem in this nation. And here to discuss the matter of the type of education that goes on in our nation's schools is Valerie Huber. She is the executive director of the National Abstinence Education Association. It's a Washington, D.C. based professional association in support of abstinence education as the optimal strategy for teen sexual health. Valerie previously served as a Title V abstinence education coordinator for the state of Ohio, where she provided oversight and grant awards to community abstinence programs serving more than 100,000 students per year as part of the Ohio Department of Health. She also founded and directed a nonprofit organization in support of character building and abstinence education during the 1990s that served all school districts in 2 counties of Ohio. And Valerie, we'd like to welcome you to the program Crosstalk today.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here, and I look forward to engaging in this conversation with you.
Yeah, a pretty astounding report that came out from the CDC last week.
Well, it is, and, we have known for a number of years that this is an epidemic among the teen and young adult population. It was about maybe 4 years ago that the CDC released another report showing that 1 in 4 teen girls has at least one STD. And when you break it down and look at African-American teen girls, it's 1 in 2. So it's not just that 50% of all of the new STDs or STIs are among the young adult population, but when you're looking at real numbers, that's pretty astounding. 1 in 3, yes, across the country, but among the teen population, it is exploding.
Wow. Well, Valerie, I'm wondering, just to kind of set the background for our discussion today, could you give us just a little history on the introduction of sex education in the schools? It hasn't always been as it is today, has it?
Well, it hasn't. Sex education really became a part of federal policy, believe it or not, around the time of World War I, and it was because soldiers were going overseas for the first time and coming back with VD, is what they called it back then. And in fact, it became a security risk, and that's why the federal government got involved, because the guy next to you in the foxhole may be fighting an STD and can't defend you in time of the conflict. So that's kind of where it got its start. But at that time, the primary message was wait to have sex until you're married, and then once you're married, remain faithful. We've gotten far away from that, where today there's a 16-to-1 disparity against abstinence education in federal sex ed policy funding, and we think it's a travesty, and the individuals who are really reaping the benefit of that wrong-headed policy are young people.
And we're going to be looking more at that disparity here through the interview. And what we're hearing, folks, from Valerie is that the morals and the values that were taught at its inception is a far cry different than what it is today. Valerie, when one looks at what is going on in our schools, one would say that our public education system today is promoting a more appropriate term would be promiscuity education. When did the shift occur from the morals and values you talked about to what's happening today? When did that shift happen?
Well, counterculturally, there was a push for more explicit sex education almost from its very onset. By the time you got to the 1920s, for example, there was a pretty strong subculture that normalized all kinds of sexual behavior, and some of it very flagrantly. But it really became a part of the mainstream culture beginning in the 80s and 90s, right in that period of time when you saw that the expectation that sex should be reserved for marriage, those boundaries started to break down, obviously, during the sexual revolution of the 60s, but there was still the expectation that you wait until you're married, and if you didn't, especially if you were a teen, you would disappear and maybe go to Aunt Margaret's house for about a year and then come back, or have a shotgun wedding. Now, sex among teens is normalized. It's almost an expected behavior among some. And those who oppose abstinence education even insist that sexual experimentation is a healthy part of teen maturation, and so abstinence education is harmful and dangerous then.
You had mentioned a funding disparity, and I'd like you to highlight that a little bit further about the funding disparity between an abstinence-based education as defined by Title V and other non-abstinence-based sex education programs.
Yes, in 2008, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services did the first comprehensive review of where federal dollars were going for sex education. Now, this was in the midst of the Bush presidency. He wanted to bring parity between contraceptive-centered sex education and abstinence education. When he took office, there was an 8-to-1 disparity. He was able to reduce it to a 4-to-1 disparity. So the 2008 HHS study showed 4-to-1.
So that's, in essence, that's $1 out of every $4 going toward abstinence-based education.
Correct.
Okay.
He wasn't able to get parity.
Mm-hmm.
However, as soon as President Obama took office, the very first budget that he sent to Congress eliminated every penny for abstinence education. We worked very hard on Capitol Hill in a bipartisan way to put a little bit of parity back into the budget, and we were successful to thwart some of the president's efforts. But even so, it is still 1-16, the most lopsided sex education initiative that we've ever had in modern time.
So, folks, keep in mind in that 4-year period, or when Mr. Bush started, it was you said it was 1-8. He brought that down to 1-4. When Mr. Obama took over, it went to $1.16 that was going toward abstinence-based education versus non-abstinence.
Correct.
Okay. And there's been even some shift even for the new year.
Yes. Well, there were members of Congress that really think that as long as the federal government is involved in sex education and setting policy for the nation, and, you know, the debate of whether or not this should be the role of the federal government is a discussion for another time, I think. But as long as it is part of federal sex ed policy, there needs to be a strong emphasis on what we call sexual risk avoidance abstinence education. There's some leaders in Congress that agreed, and so just last week, on Valentine's Day, in fact, a bipartisan team from Illinois, Representative Randy Hultgren from Illinois, the Republican, and Representative Dan Lipinski, a Democrat, introduced the Abstinence Education Reallocation Act. It's H.R. 718, and it seeks to, for the first time in modern history, establish some parity between the two approaches, putting a strong emphasis on abstinence education.
Okay, I had seen a third chart through your website that showed for 2013 what's planned for this year is actually the disparity goes to $1 to $24. So HR 718 would bring some of that parity back. What would the picture look like at that point?
Yeah, well, it still wouldn't be even 1-to-1. The FY 2013 graph that you saw, or table, illustrated President Obama's budget that he sent to Congress, where he eliminated all of the funding for abstinence education that he was able to do this year, and then even took some funds that are previously mandated to be used for abstinence education, and he wanted to reassign it for non-abstinence education activities, some more of those programs that normalize teen sex. So that's where that third graph comes in. Now, the House, I want to let you know, did not agree with that proposal, and the House draft for fiscal year 2013 actually establishes parity between the two approaches, exact 50-50. In the Senate, however, it sticks with the President's proposal, and so that's one of the many issues that is going to need to be ironed out before the end of March.
Wow. This is amazing. Again, H.R. 718 was just introduced last week on Valentine's Day, called the Abstinence Education Reallocation Act. And if that becomes law, does that dictate to schools what they have to do?
Well, it doesn't dictate to schools. What it does is it gives a real choice. Because currently, if schools want to receive sex education funds, most of those dollars are only to implement very explicit sex education programs. This provides an option for schools to apply for some competitive funding to, again, reestablish abstinence education. Under President Bush, over 1 million students were receiving abstinence education as a result of some of the funding that was established during that time. When President Obama came to office, those 1 million students lost funding almost immediately, and so they were in the midterm of those programs, and students came back to school finding that what they received last year was not going to be available the next year or those to come. So there are a lot of schools that really would like to be able to implement this again. It's in line with the community values. It's in line with what parents want. And students are resonating with the message, too. It's what they want, and yet it's just not available.
Our guest today here on Crosstalk is Valerie Huber, the Executive Director of the National Abstinence Education Association. Legislation introduced to bring some parity back to our federal tax dollars going into the school systems as to what curricula is taught and having access to curricula that's being abstinence-based. We'll have more discussion after the break. You're listening to Crosstalk.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation scientist and author at the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, today's question, the concept of race, is it an evolutionary term?
Chris, the term race first came into the English language in the 1500s from the Latin. In biology, it eventually became equated with a subspecies, a variety within a species, and that's how it's used today, particularly within humans. Race was not an evolutionary term until Darwin began to use it as such. It then began to take on a racist slant, meaning that one group was more highly evolved than another. The term race doesn't appear in the Bible. There's only one race, the human race. We're all descended from Adam. So, while race is not an evolutionary term, the concept of racism certainly is. This is another one of the evil fruits of evolution thinking. How much better to go back to Genesis and get it right.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more information, visit us on the web at icr.org.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. With 110 million sexually transmitted infections in the U.S., that's according to the Centers for Disease Control, and young people have a disproportionate number of those sexually transmitted diseases. We're talking about the issue here today on Crosstalk. Could it be with the education that we're passing on? We're speaking today with Valerie Huber, Executive Director of the National Abstinence Education Association. And Valerie, I have sat in school board meetings, and I've heard the rhetoric that abstinence education doesn't work. Matter of fact, I was on Planned Parenthood's website today, and they also have a section as to why abstinence education doesn't work. And they state right on their site, quote, "In fact, abstinence-only programs often provide inaccurate and alarmist misinformation about the effectiveness of condoms, contraceptives, and safer sex." What's your response to that?
Well, it's an incredulous statement because it's actually the programs that they're implementing in the schools that provide misinformation to young people, telling them that they're free to engage in any kind of risky sexual activity as long as they use a condom and their partner is consensual. It gives teens the unrealistic belief that sex plus a condom is safe. But here again, we have to look at another C.D.C. study, the one that said that 1 in 14 girls has at least one STD. Half of those sexually transmitted diseases that are most prolific among teens are still transmissible with the use of a condom. So it's lulling teens into a mistaken belief that they can do anything they want and not reap the consequences. And I think that it's dishonest and it's certainly unhealthy. And Planned Parenthood needs to look very closely at the kind of sex education that they are implementing, and if they really care about the health of young people, they need to do an immediate restructuring of it.
Yeah, either that or, and this is my opinion, I mean, they're providing continued clientele for their services. Let me ask you this. Last fall, your organization actually had a survey conducted of parents and their views about abstinence education. What did you find?
Well, it was a Parent Speak Out survey. It was very enlightening. We did a representative sample of parents of teens, I think it was 9 to 16-year-olds. And we wanted to know what parents across the country really felt about sex education, because this is one of those issues that, not surprisingly, is hotly contested in the halls of Congress, but it also is contested just in conversation in school board meetings and in the media. And we thought that the one group that really cares less about the debate and more about outcomes for their own children would be parents. So we oversampled Republicans, Democrats, Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic races, and then a cross-section of all of the regions across the country. And we asked them a number of questions. Here's what we found out. Parents who are Republican, parents who are Democrat, overwhelmingly supported sexual risk avoidance abstinence education. When we asked Democratic parents if they supported President Obama's perennial request to eliminate abstinence education, Democratic parents did not support the president's move to do that. Republican parents did not support that. When we asked parents, do you want your children to wait until they are married before they have sex? Overwhelmingly, parents said, yes, we do. And in fact, the one demographic that's answered that most strongly were African American parents. Now, sex ed policy pundits would argue that since the marriage rates among African American families are low, that we really shouldn't be giving an abstinence until marriage message, even though that's the healthiest message for young people. African American parents obviously do not agree. We also asked if parents wanted their children to get the Planned Parenthood or the contraceptive self-centered sex education approach to condoms, or if they wanted their children to know that sex plus a condom doesn't equal safe sex. And, of all of the questions we asked, that's the one that had the most support for the way abstinence education treats any subject. They wanted their children to know that the only safe choice is to wait to have sex, and they wanted their children to understand that condoms don't offer absolute protection.
So you found out it is not a partisan issue.
Right.
That it becomes a universal issue as far as the concern of parents in that regard. I also understand last summer that the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee actually released a report that concluded that sexual risk avoidance was a superior approach. Did their conclusions go anywhere?
Well, it's funny because a report of a subcommittee about 10 years ago that was written by a special interest group had some conclusions that were lauded for many, many years, even though it was a very flawed report, and it was in support of contraceptives. This report was barely picked up by the media, and I read it over. I've read it several times. It's a good treatment, an objective treatment of the topic. It looks at the research. It looks at the public health models and what is the best way to address any kind of risk, and particularly sexual risk for young people. I think it needs to be given a lot of play in conversation. It needs to be a serious part of the conversation in setting policy, and I'm actually hopeful that will be the case this year.
We're talking today with Valerie Huber from the National Abstinence Education Association. Any idea what percentage of schools are actually teaching an abstinence-based curriculum versus those with a comprehensive sex ed?
Yeah, it's really difficult to tell, mainly because the kind of questions that schools have been asked don't really ask the kind of questions that help to separate out which schools are teaching what. I guess you could say the best study out there was released, it's been several years ago now, by the Guttmacher Institute, which was a subsidiary of Planned Parenthood, but now is a standalone organization. Nonetheless, they found that about 1 in 4 schools taught abstinence education, and the other 75% of schools taught so-called comprehensive sex education. Mm-hmm. Since then, however, funding for abstinence education has been cut dramatically, so my guess is that those numbers have dropped out even more, not because schools aren't supportive of the message, but many of them that we have personal accounts of just didn't have the funding to continue those programs after President Obama took away their programs.
Well, Valerie, you mentioned the House bill was just introduced last week, H.R. 718. Folks, write that down, H.R. 718. That's in the House. The Senate version is going to be introduced right after the recess through Senator Lindsey Graham's office. How is it that our listeners can get engaged behind legislation like this? Those who are concerned about the issues you're raising today, Valerie, what can they do?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked, Jim, because the success of this legislation really is dependent upon your listeners. We really need to have a minimum of 100 members of Congress in the House co-sponsor H.R. 718. We had about 70 co-sponsors when it expired at the end of the last session. This year, we need to get many more than that. There are some new members that just came as freshmen who we believe that would be supportive of abstinence education and could get behind and co-sponsor this, but they need to be contacted by constituents in their district. If you don't mind, I'd like to give the House switchboard number that any of your listeners can call.
Very good.
It's 202-225-3121. That's 225-3121. When you reach a switchboard operator, you can just ask for your member of Congress. If you don't know who that is, if you give them your zip code, they can look it up and then connect you with that office. And then when someone answers, you just need to say that what your name is, that you're a constituent of Congressman or Congresswoman so-and-so, and that you urge them to co-sponsor H.R. 718, the Abstinence Education Reallocation Act. We will then follow up with any members whom you have contacted, and we will share more details about the benefits of this bill. But it's really important for constituents to make that first call.
Folks, again, that phone number to the Capitol Switchboard for the House of Representatives, 202-225-3121. It's a number you've heard often on Crosstalk, 202-225-3121. Those of you who are web conversant, you can find direct dial numbers directly to your congressman as well by going to house.gov. Click on the representatives. You can find them by state or by name, and you can have quick access direct dial numbers right into their offices where you can talk with their staff members. That's house.gov, or of course by calling through the switchboard. If you don't know who your congressman is, 202-225-3121. And as you mentioned, last session, I know this was introduced. I think on the Senate side, there were only a couple of co-sponsors that came alongside this. Are you confident that there's a momentum that's building with this new legislation?
I really am. Since the legislation was just introduced a few days ago, and then Congress is now on recess for the President's Week recess, we've just begun the outreach to congressional offices, but a number of them have already become original co-sponsors again. There are new freshman members that we've reached out to say, yes, this is something that we need. I think that the research showing that this doesn't need to be a Republican versus Democrat issue, I think is encouraging, and it tells the Republican congressmen and congresswomen that they're on the right side of this, and it shows those Democrat members who have not been supportive of abstinence education that they're out of touch with their constituents. We're really encouraged that this was introduced in a bipartisan way, and we are very encouraged that there will be members from both sides of the aisle that will be co-sponsoring again this time around.
And what's interesting is that even with this legislation, President Obama, you mentioned, has had a policy of eliminating federal funding of abstinence programs. It would seem to me that he would then be faced with the decision whether to sign this into law or not.
Well, I think that if it passed both houses, I think he would be hard-pressed to veto it because the House obviously is Republican-controlled. The Senate is Democratic-controlled. So that would show that there's wide bipartisan support for this measure. And I think it would be politically unattractive to him to veto.
We're speaking with Valerie Huber, and she is from the National Abstinence Education Association. I've got a few more things I want to probe from our guest today, and then we'll be opening our phone line. So be listening here. We'll give that number out in just a moment. You're listening to Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network.
If you were asked how you know the Bible is true, do you have an answer? We are living in an increasingly skeptical society, whether it comes to politics, science, or even faith. People see conflict everywhere, even about fundamental aspects of the Bible. Sadly, many church leaders are at odds about biblical truth and scriptural authority, leaving believers confused and uncertain, and in need of clear biblical teaching. In the books, How Do We Know the Bible is True?, editors Ken Ham and Bodie Hodge have compiled from numerous authors responses to many questions, such as, is the Bible totally without error? Did the resurrection really happen? How do we know the 66 books of the Bible are from God? And numerous other issues. Volume 1 or Volume 2 are available for a donation of $17 each, or both can be obtained for a donation of $30 to VCY America by calling 1-800-729-9829. 1-800-729-9829.
With us today is Valerie Huber from the National Abstinence Education Association. Valerie, I know you've got a website that you can tell our listeners about to stay abreast of what's taking place with this legislation.
Yes, we invite them to go to theNAEA.org, and there's also a spot on our website that if they would like to receive regular updates, they can sign up for our newsletter that comes about every other week. It lets them know what's going on in their state, if they need to become engaged, what's going on at the national level, and opportunities in their own community to defend their children or their grandchildren from explicit sex education.
Okay, again, that's the NAEA.org.
Correct.
And then also I found out I can get to your site through going abstinenceassociation.org.
You are very clever, that's right. Either of those would work, but it's usually a lot easier for people to just put in the NAEA because there are all kinds of opportunities to misspell abstinence especially.
Good point. The NAEA.org, and that stands for National Abstinence Education Association. Valerie, while this has been introduced previously, I've seen, looking through the congressional website, that other legislators have introduced legislation to actually do away with funding for abstinence education. I saw one bill called Repealing Ineffective and Incomplete Abstinence-Only Program Funding Act of 2011. Why is this such a battle? It seems like a no-brainer. It seems like common sense. Why such a battle?
That is such a good question. We make it a point to visit with congressional offices on both sides of this issue and on both sides of the aisle. And what I've found is there's so much misinformation about what abstinence education truly is that there are some members who didn't support it simply because they only heard its definition from anti-abstinence groups. In fact, quite a liberal member, after having a pretty lengthy conversation, said, I think that our office is going to change our view on this after having a conversation. We had no idea that this is what an abstinence education program was. So NAEA really understands that there's so many untruths out there. We could just have a good conversation and only the facts come out. I don't think it would be so contentious. There are, however, groups and individuals who don't care about the truth and who unfortunately don't even care about the health of our young people. They only want to win an ideological battle. I would just want to give you an example. Back several years ago, there was a hearing in the House, and the hearing was on the effectiveness of abstinence education. The chairman was Henry Waxman, a liberal Democrat from California who has been a historic opponent of abstinence education. He assembled a team of witnesses for this hearing. Most of them, all but one, in fact, were anti-abstinence experts. One member asked the experts, one member of Congress, if there was evidence showing that abstinence education was as effective or more effective than so-called comprehensive sex education, then would you support voluntary programs for abstinence education? Do you know, even though this hearing was on the effectiveness of abstinence education, all but one of the witnesses said no, even if there was research showing that abstinence education was effective, we would still not support it.
Don't confuse me with the facts.
Exactly, and I think it really pulled the screen away from this whole issue because our opponents are always in the press and in debate saying, we only want what works. It's because abstinence education doesn't work. It's the only reason that we don't support it. Well, it does work. And they revealed that their true agenda, I think, during this hearing. It doesn't matter if it works. We oppose it. We don't care if it helps young people make healthier choices, if it helps them wait to have sex twice as long as their peers. That's not important. What's important to us is winning this ideological battle.
Yeah. One more thing here before we get to the phone lines, and I'd like to talk just a moment about the role of schools. This past Sunday on FoxNews.com, they carried a story about an Arizona teacher that assigned her elementary fourth grade class a homework assignment that alluded to a situation of infidelity. And they were quoting an ABC Channel 15. Students at an elementary school in Gilbert, Arizona were asked to read passages last week detailing a certain situation. Then, according to the station, the students were asked to describe what is happening and what should be done about it. But one of the questions was about a wife finding another woman's hair clip under her bed with hair in it that didn't belong to her. And so here we have a young fourth grader that's supposed to respond to this. A parent said, I don't care what age, it's not something the school should be bringing up. The parent alerted the teacher, who quickly emailed parents apologizing for the adult-themed homework. This is fourth graders, explaining she hadn't actually read the entire assignment. And so the student, completed the assignment, suggesting the husband had cheated, was in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just baffled here, Valerie, as to how things like this even make it into the school curriculum.
Well, there is a slippery slope when you start talking about age appropriateness. It seems like a term that all of us would agree upon, but unfortunately there's not an objective definition that everyone agrees with. So those who really push the envelope on sexually suggestive topics and initiating even sex education in kindergarten believe that anything is age appropriate as long as the child can have an elementary understanding of what it means. It has nothing to do with their developmental stage. We take great issue with that, and this is certainly an example, isn't it?
Well, folks, let's open our phone lines. Do you agree or disagree with our guest today? Does there need to be a better equity as it relates to the federal funding that's going to schools as far as the curriculum that is being taught and having access to funds to teach an abstinence-based curriculum? Our telephone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. 800-733-9829. We'd like to get your response to this issue here today. Keep in mind it's H.R. 718. H.R. 718. That's a House bill that has just introduced last week. The Senate bill will be introduced by Lindsey Graham coming up here in the very near future. Matter of fact, Valerie, you're holding something called the 2013 Abstinence Day on the Hill on March 12th. Tell us about that.
Yes, that's an opportunity for students, parents, citizens to come to Washington, D.C., let us know that you're coming, and we will arrange face-to-face conversations between you and your congressional office to show support for H.R. 718, for abstinence education in general. It's a great opportunity. In addition to that, we're having a congressional briefing that same day where we're inviting congressional offices to hear about the effectiveness of abstinence education, to learn what this whole initiative is all about, and to also learn that, when we're talking about sex education, which is primarily for 15 to 17-year-olds, that's kind of the primary age topic, 75% of those teens have never had sex. So why is it that most of the sex education that they are receiving is normalizing sex?
Yeah. Well, folks, we'd like to hear what you have to say. Again, our number 800-733-9829. We're going to begin with a caller in Tennessee. Go ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Yes, I believe that if young children aren't taught morally about sex, that we should treat these teenage girls like I have a friend. She has an unwed daughter who's going on her third baby, and she's unmarried by 3 different fathers. If I had a daughter, I'd get medieval and I'd put a chastity belt on her, and I'll take my answer off the air.
Well, I think certainly there have to be those morals and values that are taught in the home, but what we're seeing take place in many a school district is quite alarming. That really gives students all the know-how, the techniques, and the encouragement to go ahead and experiment. And there's some problems with that, Valerie.
Well, there is. I think that the caller's comment brings up another issue, and that is we are the strongest believers that parents need to be the primary sex educators for their children. Mm-hmm. And that abstinence education programs, whether in the school or in the church or in a community center, need to come alongside what parents are already doing. The fact of the matter is, though, a lot of parents are not having the conversations that they need to, and this is not just a single talk. It needs to be an age-appropriate, continuing conversation as your children develop and mature. Some parents aren't talking because they're uncomfortable with the topic. Some aren't talking because they're not especially proud of maybe some of the decisions they made as teens themselves, and so they think that it would be hypocritical for them to tell their teen son or teen daughter that they would like them to wait until they're married before they have sex. I like to really encourage parents, though, that there are a lot of things that we did as children and as teens that we're not especially proud of. It might be something as simple as telling a lie. Do we then not expect honesty from our children? Well, of course we do. It's not hypocrisy. It's maturity, and it's parenting, teaching our children through the mistakes we may have made so that they don't have to repeat them in their own lives. The other thing that I think is really important for your listener to be encouraged with is when teens who are sexually active are mentored and encouraged to choose a different choice in the future, and that is abstinence, and they receive the encouragement and the skills to do that, we're finding that this particular group is more open to an abstinent lifestyle than just about any other. We're seeing it very, very effective, but they have to be receiving realistic message and encouragement and skills from people who genuinely care and aren't just expecting that they're going to continue to have sex, and we just hope that they use contraception next time.
Jerry, in Milwaukee, you're on the air.
Yeah, what I'd like to know is there statistics, because we regarding how many students have died from venereal disease versus abstinence programs, because, we have our president during that shooting with those kindergartners that said if we can save one life, it's worth it. So if we can save one life by promoting abstinence, that surely, he would, he would have to absolutely agree with me that's worth it, going that route. And you would think the Democratic Congress would realize that, oh yeah, he wants to save lives. So if he wants to save lives, and if anyone has died from a venereal, which we both know people have, maybe in their later years, do you have any numbers on that?
Well, I don't know how many people have actually died as a result of any of the STDs. Obviously, HIV has a high mortality rate, not as high now as it did. What we do know, though, is many have STDs, and they have lifelong consequences for many teens.
Jerry, you brought up a good point. Certainly there is a double standard here. If it saves one life, then we ought to do thus and so. We've heard that rhetoric, and certainly we need to apply it in this situation as well. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. Recently, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a liberal foundation, put out a report in which they admitted that they were giving money to evangelicals for them to become a voice in pushing sustainable development. Well, for those of you who don't know, sustainable development came out of the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Sustainable Development, or Agenda 21, is the framework for global governance. It includes abortion on demand, population control. It includes ending the Second Amendment rights of American citizens. It includes public housing, the expansion of the welfare state, the end of parental authority, the promotion of pagan spirituality in our schools, and much, much more. That's Sustainable Development. That's Agenda 21. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund admits in their own document they're giving money to evangelical organizations and individuals for them to push this on the church. Now, you talk about a religious Trojan horse, that's a religious Trojan horse.
Well, certainly the time does pass quickly here, but want for you to have opportunity to speak with our guest today, Valerie Huber from the National Abstinence Education Association. If you missed the contact information, I have a sheet of paper handy. We will give it before we leave the air here in just a few minutes. We'll give you their website. We'll give you a point of contact here for the U.S. House as well as it relates to this matter. Let's go right back to the phone lines. We have Marianne calling from Wisconsin. Go ahead, Marianne.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm so glad to hear this bill is being put forward, and I'm wondering if it contains any references to the cost to taxpayers in just the medical treatment of young people from these STDs, and not only that, but there has to be some psychological impacts and treatment too. There's a cost for all of that, and
yeah,
I should think, there should be references in the bill to that.
Mm-hmm. Leslie or Valerie, does the bill have any costs like that? I know the story I had at the beginning cost taxpayers about $16 billion, the sexually transmitted diseases.
Yeah. $16 billion, did you say?
$16 billion. That's from the Centers for Disease Control.
Per year. The costs that you mention are not actually in the bill, but they are actually going to be brought out, and we're updating those figures to current 2013 numbers for the congressional briefing that's going to be on March 12th, and that is kind of kicking off the real assertive effort to find co-sponsors for this bill. So while it's not in the actual language, it's very much a part of the strategy for passage of this bill.
Thank you, Marianne.
I also think that there should be some education. The education should include teaching the children that they've got to be responsible to tell their partners that they've got an STD so that they can prevent them from transmitting it.
And you know what? If we're promoting a message of abstinence, we don't even have to get that far, do we? Appreciate the call here, Marianne. To Daniel in Rochester, Minnesota, you're on the air.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. I just want to applaud your guest, Valerie, for her uphill battle against what they're doing in our school system. In 1 Peter it says to be holy in all of our conduct, because the one who called us is holy. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a real attack on the purity, because the pure of heart will see God. And I think it was John Dooley who introduced him to the school system to change the school system, and it just seems it's definitely an agenda to pin kids against their parents, and also to get the government to have more control of the kids. So if there's anything we can do, I mean, I have a 4-year-old, and he's a boy, but I don't even want him in the public school system because of the garbage that they're teaching our kids, and there's a lot of parents not, being parents or letting somebody else raise their kids, and everything they see and they hear is planting a seed in their heart. Yeah. And it's so important to steer them up in godly principles. Yeah. So.
Good point, Daniel. Appreciate you raising that. And I know, Valerie, that part of these the sex education curricula really has they will start at kindergarten or pre-kindergarten curricula to start desensitizing young people's minds in this area.
Well, it's true, and I really appreciate the seriousness that the last caller has upon parenting, and really recognizing the impact of messaging and training up your children. I also want to encourage even those parents who either are contemplating homeschooling or are homeschooling their children that doesn't mean that they don't need to be concerned about what's being taught in the public school, because we never, I thought about this. You never know who your son or daughter is going to marry one day. And, not just our concern for the overall culture, which is certainly a good enough reason, but also the intimate concern for our children and the families they will have one day, that even if our child is receiving everything that they should be, perhaps their future spouse isn't.
Good point. Thank you so much. Dave, go ahead. You're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call and your stand for but the righteousness to abstain from sex before marriage. There is no such thing as safe sex, really, but really the word calls it saved sex, and a child needs to know that they save themselves for marriage. And also, one thing, I did take a stand down here in our city against the sex ed in the Milwaukee schools, and we know how then you know that they teach unholy and unnatural things.
Unnatural, I call it promiscuous, yeah.
Yes, that shouldn't be taught, and God wants us to be holy, and really I'm glad that you're taking a stand, but then also we need to take a stand of the things that are being put out, in the cosmopolitan magazines, on the Red Book, and it still talks about sex and also talks about perversion, and that's my comment.
Thank you,
Take a
Dave.
stand and then keep up the good work for Christ.
Thank you, Dave, for your call here today. Valerie, we're just about out of time. We have just a minute left. I'd like you to repeat, though, that bill number, the point of contact, because momentum is just starting. Our listeners are among the first hearing about this, just introduced last week. The Senate bill is going to be coming forth here in the next days to come. So give us that vital information, if you would.
Yes, we encourage your listeners to call their member of Congress, and they can call the switchboard at 202-225-3121 to voice their support for the Abstinence Education Reallocation Act, which is H.R. 718 in the House. And
again, your website as well?
Yes, it's the NAEA.org, and if they'd like to read a little bit more about that survey that we talked about of parents, they can go to the website whattheytoldus.org.
Okay, whattheytoldus.org, and then so you can read about that survey there, and then also, folks, the site for our guest, the NAEA.org, National Abstinence Education Association. The House bill is H.R. 718. The number to call, 202-225-3121, or go to house.gov and click on Representatives. You'll find the direct number to their offices. Valerie, thanks for carving an hour of your time out to join us and our program listeners today on Crosstalk.
It was a pleasure.
Valerie Huber has been our guest, Executive Director of the National Abstinence Education Association. A piece of legislation, folks, that's going to bring some equity back into the matter of the type of education that is available to schools all across the nation. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.